So, hi everyone. Welcome to Doomer Optimism. I am James. You guys know me. I'm here with a special guest who you may not know this, Congresswoman, but we don't usually do like big intros. That's like kind of the fun of it is that everybody's a little normal. Um, but I'm here with what I believe to be our first sitting congressperson. Um, and Maria, we're really excited. I think there's like a lot of sort of overlap with, I would say, our politics in this little sphere of the world and media, but also maybe just like more importantly, like our interests. And so we were talking just before I hit the record button about what kind of truck I drive. Which
Yeah, the people need to know. The people need to know.
Well, these people all do know. Um, because I believe I coined the term Forerunner nationalism. Uh, uh, and then my Forerunner has a bit of an engine problem. A spark plug fell apart in a cylinder.
Mm.
And I spent a lot of time trying to fix it. This really does bleed in a way into what I was going to ask you. That's why we're doing this little trick here. But so I ended up buying a new Toyota Tacoma, a
What year?
2023.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I
Right?
appreciate the loyalty to Toyotas.
Yeah,
But well, TBD on how this is going to hold up for 23.
yeah. I can't say I love it. Um,
Yeah.
and I can't say I love the feeling of like I've never changed the oil in it. Like I take it to,
Mm.
I take it to service. And like it's
It
not
took
my.
it took me
Yeah.
forever to find a place to take my used oil here.
Oh, that's interesting.
It, yeah. Yeah.
For people who are maybe not aware, here I think means DC, right?
Yes. Yeah. I had my truck shipped over because it was
Gotcha.
like a semblance of home.
Hmm. And so, what kind of truck is? What's your truck?
I brought out a 97 Land Cruiser. It's like that's the last year of the 80 series.
Yeah.
It's the only time that like the Capitol Police recognize me as a member is when I'm in that truck because there's none of them out here. Uh,
That's really funny. That's really funny. Yeah, we have several sort of organizers of our events who I believe are owners of that genre of Land Cruiser. Um, and so the reason this would maybe bleed into the question is like I think we wrestle a lot, maybe like as a circle of people in coming from the rural West or coming from ag backgrounds and things like this with this question of right to repair. And so I definitely wanted to have you on to talk about that. I think that's like the money
yeah.
topic that everyone's kind of interested in. I was gonna start though with a little like big picture thing, which is that I think in our world we would, and maybe yours as well, there's a very distinct sense that like part of why climate policies have not been broadly politically popular was that they felt like they were an adoption of technologies that felt distant from people, that felt
Yes.
like it was a top-down project.
Yes.
And I
And
was
it
wondering
was
if
like,
you could speak to that. Yeah.
yeah, well, and it was like a back door for planned obsolescence. Like, I don't give a fuck if your washing machine uses 2% less energy if the fucker only lasts 3 years now. And there's been a very narrow accounting of what environmentally friendly is. And it has not included the trades. It has not included the middle class. Like my stove is from 1953, I think. It's like an old O'Keefe and Merritt. And you think about how much wealth that thing has built up, like in middle class families being resold, like being like lasting. And it's like become environmentalism has become a consumer product and not a way of being in the world where you make things that last and you are a steward of them and not just like a hapless consumer dependent on a stream of cheap shit from somewhere else. And like that's the problem. Like that is the moral corruption of the idea of environmentalism. Like a lot of the older loggers I know like did consider themselves environmentalists, like because they loved the woods. But when it becomes a liberal merit badge or some kind of like um I always forget the word that like the Catholics you could pay um uh
Tithe.
no, like you could pay for doing
Oh,
bad things by
oh yeah,
giving the
yeah.
church money.
Not
A
a
lot
dispensation, but yeah,
yeah,
the
yeah, like that and it's like maybe you should just reckon with the fact that like you made your money in an ugly way and stop making your money that way and stop telling me that I'm the problem in the system, you know?
Right.
And like
Right.
making like the idea that of like nature as a terrarium that you can't engage with without spoiling it. And I think like, yeah, I think that's a serious liability.
Can we talk like sort of inside DC, sort of as, I mean, I'm sure you've been basically subject to this actually, but like in the time since Antonia and I came to DC, I've basically spent my time going to places and having people ask me, so what is the new Democratic answer, right? And like who's going to be the next Democratic answer, right? And that part of like what we saw right after the election was actually maybe the answer is you. But in terms of the politics we're talking about, like I think a lot of listeners and people in this kind of weird, crunchy, maybe I'm not Trumpy, but maybe I'm not Trumpy world that everybody's discovering existed that for the last 100 years in America. I guess the skepticism is that someone in the Democratic Party who would express the view that you just had could actually do anything. And I'm wondering if that's your sense. I'm wondering if that's maybe you have a sense that people have learned. I have a sense amongst Democrats I talk to that there's a lot of learning going on.
I don't know. I mean, I see a lot of like kind of like plasticity, and they're just going back to the same pollsters who are, you know, it's like you get the answer to the question that you asked, and people are asking the wrong questions, and there's not the kind of flexibility to think about like, did I ask the right question in the first place? And maybe I shouldn't be asking questions and I shouldn't have the mic at all. But I should be listening with humility and curiosity about the world around me, you know, and like, who is my neighbor, you know? I think it's really, it's very uncomfortable to like consider yourself as part of the problem, you know, and I, you know, it's also difficult because it's like, I've been here for like 2 years. Like, I don't have, I guess I've seen some movement in that, like, you do have a different tool set just being a normal person and being here and talking candidly about shit. And like, that does provide a certain like latitude for you to like just say what you think. It's sort of like out of the mouths of babes kind of thing. But I think I also have at times felt like people just want like a working class poster child without actual agency. And like, that's
Right.
what I strongly reject.
Right.
And that's why I'm like very hesitant to like, you know, join some like, you know, upstart. Like, I think like, you know, for me, like in my family, like a lot of the times that like there were Democrats in my family, they were Blue Dog Democrats. Like, that still has like we've been doing this work for a long ass time, actually being loyal to the land and being loyal to our communities and like listening to normal people, you know, and I guess I think about kind of like what is the opportunity for systemic reform in terms of changing who's at the table. It's like, I think like sometimes I like hold these meetings and I'm like, I would have never been invited here and now I'm convening it. And how do I change the room itself so that it's like I kind of have this internal metric where I'm like, if this person was paid to talk to me, I kind of shrink the opinion and like weight it to the proportion of people in my community who are paid to talk about politics. But if somebody had to get a babysitter to come talk to me, like, I listen quite closely to them, and I go out and I seek them out, and I'm like trying to talk to people that don't traditionally, because like, you do not get good policy without everybody at the table. Like, you just get good ideas and like, yeah.
So let me actually
Good ideas.
Right. So let me actually speak to that. So I guess the sort of what you might say the counter vision, and then let's maybe circle even farther back and talk about like this background you're talking about and like how you would end up talking to us about this stuff and knowing about this stuff, which is obviously very rare for someone in Congress. But so this sort of like the obvious counterpoint to you in terms of like a figure in another party would be Thomas Massie, who like I've written about like at great length, who I just talked to Jared Polis for a long time, because I was basically doing propaganda for you and Polis and thinking about some of this stuff in the pages of Vanity Fair. And, you know, with Massey, there's something very appealing about it because it's actually very simple. It's like, so you just do the self-reliance again, you do the Jeffersonian democracy thing again, you just blow up the regulatory state, and like, people are going to have to stand up. And if they don't, well, okay, but this was how we built America. And actually, that's your climate solution as well. So it's like you rebuild this free, self-reliant spirit at the same time as you solve the climate problems, at the same time as you solve the corporate oligarchy. Like, everything is linked, like it's a vision. And whether or not you agree with that vision, it's something that, like, if you explain it to me, I can go, well, I can't see it. Right. And I think this sort of criticism, I'm not saying like now you argue against Massey. I'm saying like the thing that sometimes would be lost for someone when I was talking to my New York Times editor yesterday about Jared Polis is she was asking like, so what's his plan? Like, what is he actually like? What's his vision? And I was a little stumped knowing some of the constraints that exist within the party and things like that. And so I was just wondering if sort of like, what's your counterpoint? Why is anyone in a party at all anymore? What is the purpose of this as a practical politics? Like, what are you doing? If you can elaborate something that would sort of be a countermanding vision from the Massey thing.
Well, I recently heard this term I really like. It's not a argument of deregulation. It's an argument of de-proceduralization, where it's like you believe people that they are in childcare because because they love children, because they love that world, you know, and that you're not going to legislate morality or care or intelligence. And that, in fact, like all of the ways that you could measure intelligence are not fucking captured by a state exam, you know, so it's like, trust people that they want to do a good job and recognize that you don't have, you know, like I was talking to somebody and they were like, yeah, well, the licensor that, you know, authorizes my childcare to exist, like, hasn't worked in childcare before and just graduated from college with a degree in criminology. So clearly, like, they are coming here with the idea that I'm a criminal and I'm doing something wrong. And they're the ones who know what's going on. And like, that's a real problem. And it is offensive to me. You know, like I remember like running our auto shop, having an inspector from OSHA come out and ask me if my AC machine was a welder. And I'm like, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about and you can shut down my business. And
Right.
like, that's a problem.
Right.
You know, and it's like, you know, to me, this goes back to like, why did 46% of Hispanics vote for Trump? Because a lot of us own businesses in the trades. And we have felt profoundly disrespected by a lot of the, you know, regulations that have been put in place, like a boot over our neck, that in fact have just prohibited us from competing on a fair footing with the big guys.
Yeah.
So like, I would say it's not just about like blowing the system up. It is about changing who has agency, and like this argument for localism, not in the service of self-interest or like regional interest, but in saying that like, when all of us show up with a fierce loyalty to our communities, not the idea of environmentalism as a whole, but to the Gifford Pinchot, warts and all, like, then you get good policy, and not until you are fiercely loyal to the thing itself and not to the extrapolation of it, which has been captured by outside interests that
Right.
aren't informed, that aren't like, you know, aware.
And for people who don't know, Gifford Pinchot was pioneering, actually, like patrician Yale forester, but just sort of pioneering forest service in an era where, like, you know, arguably, this might get back actually to talking about timber and your family background and things like this. But sort of arguably, like, the thing that would unite, like something that you and Jared Polis want to do, and in fact, like what a lot of like quote unquote post neoliberal centrist Dems want to do with this sort of broader MAGA project, is this kind of like rematerialization of society. This kind of like, there is a material basis for like our national wealth, for like the actual national good. Like you want to have a nice army. I just read in the New Yorker, like they just can't find, I didn't actually know this. I thought it was people just didn't want to join the army. in fact, it is that we are so unhealthy and not producing like well enough people to actually fill the ranks. And that was actually sort of surprising to me, even though it totally fits with what we're talking about. And so just to go to Gifford Pinchot, like the thing that this raises is this question of like, I think you and I can agree, like in the broader Western sphere, like even if a lot of environmental regulation was done with good intent, and even if in fact it has actually had broadly good effects on these lands in certain ways, which we can talk about, but the political downstream effect of it has been in very large part to basically alienate a lot of people working in a very material world who feel like they're lectured by people who are now coming out of this school that Gifford Pinchot founded, which is Yale School of the Environment, which I was accepted to and decided not to go to because I was like, I can't be one of these kids being produced at the rate of 50,000 a year coming out of these environmental schools, coming to lecture people when like you really never touch stuff. And so this is a long way of going to this thing. I always bring this up, but I actually don't think I brought this up on this podcast. I work tree planting sometimes, right? And Hal Herring, who's a friend of the pod and one of America's great naturalists, runs the crew. And he runs it with well-paid people who have to be American citizens. He's very like specific about this because he wants to have this kind of feeling that this is a national project and things like this. And he's paying people 65 cents a tree, which is a lot more than the 15 cents a tree that normal people are getting, right? But the thing that we run into is that there's just way too many manager level people telling us how to do the project, and there's no nursery capacity. So what we end up doing is running out of plants every single time because the only place we get the plants are a women's prison in Wyoming. So how does this make sense? What are these kids doing?
Dude, I have the same metric of like a rebalancing of clipboards to work boots. You know, like maybe you just have confidence that people in work boots know shit you don't know and like have material interest in being successful and not seeing, you know, wildfire is the second largest emitter of CO2 in Washington state. Like feels like a, you know, No, I kind of had a similar like thing where I was like touring some like conservation timberland with somebody and they were like, I just don't know why these loggers can't trust the science. And I was like, I do. Because in living memory, you know, these scientists came out and told us that we needed to straighten the stream beds and remove all the woody debris. And now you are helicoptering in root wads, you know, into the stream beds and like, you know, making them crooked again and making them natural again. And my schools don't have air conditioning.
Yeah.
You know, like.
And in fact, like the science has been, I'm sorry, but this is just true. The science has been politicized. The Sierra Club, no one sue me, but at least the last time I checked, the Sierra Club's no-cut policy was still in place. Like, you know, does that make sense? Like, think about all of the stems in these like small watersheds that are pulling, as in fact, Donald Trump pointed out recently, that are pulling a lot of water from those like very delicate ecosystems. That's not normal, right? You sort of think that you would need some to rethink, right? So that's political science. I'm sorry, it just is. So maybe because I actually mentioned this in the pages of Vanity Fair, and then the fact checker was like trying to go back and learn more about your family history because apparently you had uncles who were loggers. You come up from this background. There's a lot of stuff people can Google about you, you know, sort of your current, you know, sort of path into politics. But what about this family background?
Yeah. So, so here, this is my, I'm going to just like, this is, you see that? That is my great, I think great Aunt Ivy, somewhere around Tenino. And that's like, that we got that from a glass plate from my grandpa, glass plate photography. So like a lot of family, you know, they were in timber, and my grandpa was a feller like out on the peninsula. My mom was from Forks, Washington, which was like the epicenter of the spotted owl fiasco. And I don't know if you saw this, but they just found a dead spotted owl in the middle of
You told me this.
Yeah.
So just okay. They found a dead spotted owl in Mount Tabor Park, right? This is what you're talking about.
In the middle of Portland, Oregon. And it had died of rodenticide.
Right.
And it was like, did anybody at like the company that produced that rodenticide lose their job? Like, no, they didn't.
Right.
It is always people with the least amount of power who foot the bill first. And like, that does not make sense. Like, that's not right. And it's just because like, we're not out here lobbying members of Congress to like tell the fuller picture.
So I've talked, but it's been a couple of years now. So I talked on this podcast at kind of great length when I was living up in Dunsmuir, California, with Dawn, if anyone wants to go back and look at this, about spotted owl and timber and things like that. But I'm actually not a policymaker. Some of this is like, as a journalist, like some of this is I spend more time talking to people in trailer parks than actually like seeing some of the higher level policy stuff. So I was wondering, as a politician, can you just walk us through the downstream effects of sort of what the spotted owl crisis was and how it got us a little bit to where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, it's like this big confluence of things, like including the import-export market and like mill capacity and all this stuff, right? But from our experience in my family, basically it was like they found this endangered species, and this owl was more important to lawmakers than our family, and like basically they increased the area around old growth timber that couldn't be cut to try to protect this species, this spotted owl. And now today, like spotted owl numbers have not come back, and they've just announced like a bounty. You can like go out and beanbag barred owls to try to create more of a habitat for barred owl or spotted owls. And it's like, for us, it just feels like, that story there's a story about Jimmy Carter getting flown over Mount St. Helens, which is in my district.
Whoa.
And they're like, he's like flying over on his way to see it. And he's like, oh my God, the devastation. And they're like, sir, that's a clear cut. We're not in the blast area yet.
Right.
And like, I've had this experience with some of my, other relations that are like, they'll drive past a clear cut and they're like, that's so sad. This is so sad. And I'm like, I don't think that's sad. Like, I think like the trailer parks where everybody's unemployed now because you've eviscerated, the mills, like that's sad to me. I think the wildfires are sad. I think they're and I get it. Like if you're a wealthier person and you have all of your needs and wants met, it's a lot easier to start looking around at like a cute owl, or someone somewhere else to try to take care of that rather than look at your neighbor and feel like accountable because your neighbor's like annoying, whatever, that you don't like that they're rolling coal. You don't like that they're like whatever, it's just easier to have empathy for a cute bird than it is for your neighbor. But like, I believe that like the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself, not to love like a sympathetic creature more than yourself.
So this is kind of gets into the weeds of this stuff that some people will know, some people won't, so whatever. But, kind of the kind of like dream version of like how we could have done everything right is that there was a lot of clear cutting, in riparian areas and stuff that was like super devastating. And then you come back and you have all these forests that now have these little stems where we're suppressing fire now. So you have these what are called even-aged forests with small, unhealthy trees competing with each other for water and sunlight and canopy and all this kind of stuff. And then when a fire does come through, they all get devastated again. And the dream version is like under the Spotted Owl Agreement, there was supposed to be a lot of board feet still coming off the lands, the public lands where all of this cutting was happening, right? And so the idea was that people had kind of woken up to like, we're going to log our way out of a livelihood anyway if we don't adjust. So let us adjust. And we're learning, we're seeing this. But then instead it all just got shut down. And instead of the board feet coming off in this, it gets more complicated than this, but in this magical promise of like, now we're going to do mixed age logging, we're going to do this much more intelligently and this kind of thing. The idea was like, the problem became that actually like every time you tried to do a timber sale, you would just have lawfare coming in and people would just sue you. And that was like culture war. That was just saying like, no, we're going to put you out of business.
We have a bigger legal budget than you do, so we're right.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't really understand this because they think of like timber companies, like big, evil timber companies, of which there are many. But that's not really who was always getting
what
sued.
contributes, but what contributes to consolidation is when you hold up a timber sale for many years and every mom and pop has their truck repossessed.
Right.
That's how you get That's how you get the big bad guys who don't live there. Right. If you want to have people who are accountable and who live where they work and who are dependent on a relationship to the woods, not of like a terrarium, but of mutual dependence, stop crushing the mom and pops. Right. Like that's like that, or like maybe, I don't know, help mills capitalize for like smaller diameter, or whatever it is, like, help us build the infrastructure to move pulp more easily, or what, like these bigger systemic, like the infrastructure of small business, not litigating every, and that's what is driving me crazy about a lot of the shit you're hearing right now, is that like lawfare is not politics. Okay, you can be right all day long and the other side can be doing shit you don't like, but lawfare is not politics. It does not build a durable governing majority.
Right.
Like listening to people about where they are, like that does.
Right. And so, like maybe if you could tell us, like, if this is a similar situation to where you are, which, by the way, your district covers both Vancouver, Washington, so sort of Portland, virtually urban Portland in some way. I mean, I can, from my sister's house in Northeast, I can see Vancouver. It is a city. But then also it goes out into the gorge, right? Like
and then the gorge is where I live, and then it goes all the way out to the ocean, and then up to the bottom of Thurston County. Yeah, so it's so like out
counties. To Astoria area.
Yes, and then Ilwaco,
and then all the way back to like White Salmon. For that far,
it ends right at the White Salmon River. So it ends at the. It used to have White Salmon redistricting. We got to Skamania County as the end of our line.
I see. Okay. So like probably like half our listeners are like in the gorge. Like, it's a high density of anarchist people like doing beekeeping and stuff. Like there's a lot of people like that in this area. But anyway, so in terms of your district, like what happened where I am writing my current book, The Natural Division, out spring 2026, is about this kind of issue. And what happened in the consolidation that you're talking about is that essentially Sierra Pacific Industries was able to get financing from New York banks and just buy all the Southern Pacific land and then, keep consolidating. And now like people always say like timber went away. That's not really true. It's just that Sierra Pacific runs all the mills and everything is coming off of private ground that's highly mechanized, highly consolidated. And those like little like union mills, all that stuff is like gone. So like when I was like living in Hyampom in Trinity County, there used to be 3 mills there, and churches and bars and all that stuff. That's all gone. But that doesn't mean that timber's gone, because it's all surrounded by Sierra Pacific land. And they'll come up and do their cuts every once in a while. And it's like, it's like farming corn at a very slow growth rate, essentially. Is that what happened in Washington as well?
Well, we have so much federal timberland, and that's been very targeted for like litigation. And so the timber rates are nowhere near. The harvest rates are just like, what is it like? It was like 47 million board feet, and we're at like 12 or something. Like it's like terrible. The timber harvesters, and most of those are now being pulled out of Good Neighbor Authority sales. And so, which I think are cool because they allow for, basically it's like, it's less mechanized. It's a more expensive form of logging where loggers are getting paid. And like, that's one of the issues, is that even when people were paying so much for timber at Lowe's during 2020, like those stumpage rates weren't going back to the truck drivers. They weren't going back to the actual, independent contractors, or the money wasn't making its way back to actual families in my community.
Right.
And like to your point too, like we've seen this like crazy consolidation under the real estate investment trusts now. And like all of these like very, how are we, like, to me, it's like, I guess since like winning this second election, I think like, what can I get? What do I want? What is worth having? Like land is worth having. Like agency, economic agency is worth having. Like, how do we get that? Like, what are the threads to pull at to like bring more power to the middle class, like political and economic? And that's kind of what what I'm chewing at and thinking about. And that's why I keep coming back to things like, timber harvest rates, thinking about good infrastructure, thinking about right to repair, electoral reform, like that kind of stuff.
So like in terms of agency in the West, I mean, and then we can maybe close the inside baseball like timber section of this, but like in terms of the personal agency in the West, there's this funny problem, right? Where it's like a very large proportion. I'm not sure what it is in Washington, but even in California, it's 45% of the land is owned by the federal government, et cetera, as people know. And this actually was set up in a certain way to advance a sense of agency on these lands, because you, a private citizen, could go and work on common ground, almost as though in like England, old school English commons. This goes back to actually like Anglo-Saxon and, Celtic, like ways of structuring commons on the British Isles. But, fast forwarding, you had this like way of doing agency and, okay, I can make a logging company and work on this federal ground. When all of that goes away, to your point, actually, there's not a lot of land to buy. And now post asset inflation, it's all bought. And if you're a millennial or younger, your chances of buying something that you can like productively work in the West are virtually nil in terms of just like
and like the Germans just bought a crazy plot of land out in Waukegan County. Like there's
Really?
there's like crazy foreign investment happening in timber too.
Yeah. And because timber is an incredibly valuable, it just, money does grow on trees, because it's just like when everything sits for a minute because timber prices or because lumber prices are low, your asset's still growing. The value of that asset's still growing. You're still holding the real estate. All of that is like incredibly valuable. And then you can roll it into carbon credits and all blah, blah, blah. Like, it's like a lot of weird stuff you can do. So circling back to like maybe more broader politics stuff, like, I guess in terms of rematerializing things, reconceptualizing like this sense of agency, things like this, like there's this kind of coalition that actually turned out to be in play in the last election, which, you were described, what was it, the most vulnerable incumbent in Congress, and then, won comfortably. Is that fair to say? And I would suggest that probably that was because you found a bit of this coalition of like crunchy people who were maybe alienated from some of the neoliberal technocracy, democratic kind of stuff, but weren't necessarily fully on board with Trump. I bet there were a lot of people who split tickets to vote for Trump.
Oh, yeah.
And you.
Yeah. Yes. Trump won my district. Trump won my district. Like, I won by more, though, which was interesting.
See, sorry, I don't always like follow the inside baseball politics stuff, because I'm like more interested in trees. But that was my suspicion, is that that's probably what you were capturing, right? And I think there's a big question now, and perhaps an opportunity for someone like you, where like privately, I think a lot of people, including people within the Trump administration who I know, who I've talked to the last few weeks, feel like that Maha coalition is taking some L's and has arguably even maybe like been a bit betrayed in terms of like who's getting appointed at USDA, things like that. So I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask you sort of like, wither that coalition, and like, do you see them, us, perhaps even including myself in it, like sort of as having been betrayed by a Trump administration that managed to actually like speak well to them in the election?
I mean, I guess I'm like, I don't feel like I trust a lot of people in politics, and so betraying might be predicated on trusting in the first place.
Right.
Like, like I believe it when they do it. I don't believe people when they say they're going to do something. Like, I'd like, do it. Show me some receipts, But I think it's right. So like, people can point to the right problem and for the wrong reasons, or like find the wrong solutions to the right problem, you know? And it's like, you cannot discount, you get nowhere if you're just like, la, 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 the problem's not real. Like, that is so condescending to people. And like, I think that's kind of the original sin in politics, is condescension. And so, I mean, like, people talk a lot about like their mom growing up in a trailer park. And I'm like, so what the fuck are you going to do about it? Are we going to get some tax credits for putting a skirt on a mobile home and not for a $20,000 heat pump?
Right.
Because that's what I want to see. Like, I want to see a positive right to build your own home.
Right.
You know, like,
right.
I want to see like that, like, deeper, like the right to peel a banana. Like, that's what I want to see, you know?
Well, and so that's okay. You actually presaged my question again, which is sort of like, are there signals that you're seeing? Actually, let me go to a bigger question, because I just saw a tweet that made me think, actually. You know those new Toyotas that they're selling overseas that are like $10,000 and they're 4-wheel drive little pickups, you know, and everybody's like, oh my God, we'll never have those here because we have all this stuff. And somebody tweeted something that made me think, which is just, you know, if they go far enough with Doge, like, you're going to be able to order this on eBay. Like, and I was like, oh, actually that might, right? Like, that could be true. That would be predicated on destroying a regulatory structure that, like, there would be some pretty intense things that went along with that. Like suddenly, like, the NTSB just like doesn't exist for a while, and like weird things are going on. Environmental regs are just blown up and then possibly not remade, or I don't know how it all works, right? But are there big picture things that make you think like there's something to this dismantling of the regulatory state that maybe they are going to do or maybe not?
I mean, the procedure is broken, right? Like, you don't have to be a genius to see that. And like, you know, do we have to sacrifice our, like, you know, fundamental rights and agencies and like our Constitution to like enact that? Like, I hope we better not, you know. But like, I think the immediacy and like the urgency of people being able to have things that are worth having, you know, to be able to like have, you know, exercise their, like, I think like people are basically rational economic actors. The question is like, can you set up the environment in which they're like able to choose from the broader spectrum of goods and not from like an impoverished set of choices to begin with? You know, it's like,
right.
People would avoid using fentanyl if they felt like they could like own a home and raise a family and start their own business and become, you know, economically secure, you know. But like, we've like, there's a set of circumstances where like, you know, fentanyl is like 80 cents a pill, right? Like, so, you know, so and nobody can get a loan to buy property.
Right. So, okay, so one quick question, because I think I'd be remiss again in not having you speak to this to people who I think are sometimes like pretty knowledgeable about like how these regulatory systems work. Like, I've been going back and reading the Constitution. I've been going back and studying like laws from 1974. Like, wait, so impoundment works this way. Like, actually, Roosevelt did it this way, and it didn't end the republic. Like, are we in a constitutional crisis, or are we just redlining stuff that actually isn't that big of a deal? Or is there some space between those two things? Like, how do you see it?
I mean, I guess I feel like it's like, nobody I know voted for us to spend like, you know, $7 million teaching Serbians how to use, you know, inclusive language. Like, I don't know people that like, I know like my schools don't have air conditioning.
Right.
You know, like, I think there's a lot of shit happening that nobody voted for. And like, it would be, I was at some event and like talking about, you know, this idea of like lawfare is not politics. You know how much illegal shit happened to me when I was running a small business and nobody gave a shit.
Right.
And now like, now all these legal eagles want to bring the same like textbook to a knife fight.
Right.
You know, it does not make sense to me.
Right.
And I guess like anyway, so I was talking, and then this woman comes up and she's like, "How are you going to get Trump out of the Kennedy Center or whatever Kennedy Foundation?" And I'm like,
Right.
"I'm not like write better
Right.
board rules,
Right.
you know, like I there's just such a division and just such a like divorce from understanding what life is like in America right now for most of us, and versus like who's got the mic, who's been writing checks to political organizations, and, like who feels accountable to who to like,
Mhm.
and that's like the ultimate problem is like who are you accountable to? Like, are you
Right.
accountable to your schools that don't have air conditioning, or are you worried about like an electric vehicle charging station at a resort somewhere that
Right.
like nobody can afford to go to?
Yeah. So that actually, so I just went to this thing at Brookings where, which is funny because I've been on this sort of like weird, like career, like, I don't know. My life has changed a lot in the last couple of years, like, and due to some pieces and stuff that brought me into new circles and things, right? So this is like my first time kind of like, okay, now we've got a place in DC and I put on a jacket and go to Brookings to talk about like, what are we going to do now? Like this kind of stuff, right? And, you're in there and you're like, wait, like this is some really powerful people, huh? Okay, like, yeah, this is like kind of how stuff has been happening. And just to your point, like someone actually who used to work in Rubio's office and then kind of like moved in this like very like populist direction. I think he would be called center left, but he just sort of went like, how much of like this sort of stuff of like, what do we do now? Like we have to build a new center left populism is actually just our own class project, wanting to make sure that we're allowed to keep coming to Brookings and getting free lunch. And the room went silent, because and to their credit, they've all thought about it. It went silent because they've all thought about it and don't really have a good answer. And this same guy said something that I think a little bit goes to something you're hinting at, which I struggle with a lot. I know a lot of people in these circles struggle with a lot. I know a lot of people in small towns struggle with a lot. Like this question of like, what is localism? What is the localism that is suddenly, I think, resurgent in America? What is this sense of like, we lost our civic core? Like, is this like the beginning of end of days fascism? Or is it like a restoration of a very normal sense of nationalism? And so he said this thing that you'll hear on the right a lot, which is like, okay, you want to be inclusive, but to what are you including people? And like, have you lost that sense of like, what the inclusion is? And I'm just wondering for you, as someone who will like talk about localism, like how dangerous do you feel like it is to play in waters where basically like the technocrats went and said like, no, you're just like, now you're just a technocratic subject. You don't have like a civic core and stuff like that. Because if you do, like dangerous stuff happens, right? And we've now opened up a conversation of like, there's got to be a middle ground. Do you have an articulation of where that middle ground is?
Well, I can you sorry. So like there's a
Sure,
lot
I
of
know
different
there's a
pieces that like
danger.
I could like
There's danger here. I
well,
guess what I'm asking is like, is there a way to do localism without it being like the argument that you get from, I would say, like a certain kind of global technocrat is that localism is the first step towards like white nationalism, essentially. And like that's a question I think that people have wrestled with for since World War II, essentially. And right now, Trump seems to be saying like, I just don't care about that question anymore. Like,
okay, so here I like maybe I'm not understanding the or like okay, so I didn't like follow a lot of politics and shit before this. So I can't speak to like what a lot of these terms mean to people that read books and about this. But what I can say is that like your idea of diversity as having been achieved by translating lawyer gobbledygook into 8 languages is bullshit. If I still need a lawyer to start a small business in this country, fuck you. You didn't help anyone except for like lawyers, you know? So I guess that's my answer. Like, in service of what? You know, like, and that's why I think it's like somebody was saying something about how like we the the danger here is like moving away from a representative government where we are actually representing local communities, like our communities, to a system of hegemony where power is everywhere and nowhere. And like nobody is accountable for changing things and nobody has agency, and whoever postures as if they have agency has agency, as opposed to like, I have the votes. My community voted to send me here. And my community is tired of having to go through 8 different review boards to start a small business.
Right.
And like, you don't speak for me. You don't speak, like, there's been all these arguments of like, oh, like this is impacting certain communities in certain ways. But like, now we don't have jobs. Okay. Like now we don't have businesses. Now we don't have the bars and the churches. And instead of having an actual robust, like timber economy, we have golf courses and art galleries that shut down on a biannual basis. Like that's not what we want. Like we want something based on reality that we can see and touch. And like, we are nervous. We are, in fact, maybe slightly sick by the fact that we're importing 40% of our fresh fruits and vegetables. Like that's a problem to us. If we have supplanted, vegetable production in the Southeast with timber production because we're no longer cutting timber in the Northwest where it grows, like that's a problem.
Yeah. And so I guess a more specific, like grounded way of asking my big picture question was like, there at Brookings, I was sort of raising this same issue of like, you guys talk a lot about community, but what in fact is like a lot of communities, in fact, have not had a lot of control over the direction that they would be taking, whether because of economics, because of regulatory structures that we've talked about, or indeed because of, and I didn't bring this up, but because of immigration. And I was sitting next to Bill Galston, who was the policy director for Walter Mondale, which is a famous sort of center-left figure. And he raised a question of sort of bounds. Like, if you want to have communities and localism, part of the nature of having community is that actually, like, there are some people who are inside of it and some people who are not inside of it. And then what I'm getting at is, like, there's also this feeling, justifiably, I think, of people looking at Trump and going, like, he hates immigrants. Like, this is the end of days. And so I think everybody who's not an ideologue right now is a little bit wrestling with this question of like, how do you rebuild communities, but not hate others and not exclude others? And I'm just wondering, for example, like in immigration in your district, like, has this been something like very scary and new that you're seeing, or how is it playing out?
I mean, I think in my community, it's more of a concern over fentanyl trafficking. And, and that's like where a lot of I think that's motivating a lot of the concerns about border security. But like, I think that strong communities that have economic agency do not, that is when you are the least likely to be hateful or like retributive. Like when you actually have agency and you have the ability to like grow and build things, like that's the antidote to like some kind of creeping whatever danger is like trusting that people that own homes and that like own land and who can take care of their families don't need to get the knives out against their neighbor,
right? And so talking about this agency, we try and sometimes fail in these circles to like actually get stuff back out of the big picture stuff and into policy stuff that people can actually do. And I'm wondering, maybe starting with right to repair, like, okay, one option is we just destroy the regulatory state and right to repair just comes back because there's no rules anymore. But actually that probably doesn't work, because probably like unbounded by regulation, Apple is going to make it harder and harder to repair your iPhone, right? So what is stuff that people can get involved in, push levers that would help advance that agency and that vision on that specific issue?
Well, I think I'm slightly limited in like my ability to like tell people how to lobby in my official capacity. But like I think it is really important that people understand that like like people's personal experience should matter to the representatives of like, I used to be able to replace a light bulb for $3 in my headlight, and now it costs $700 and I have to do the whole assembly.
Right.
Like that should matter to a elected official. And people should view that problem as within the realm of, the legislative portfolio of their representative.
Right.
Why is this shit happening, and not just accept it as a given that there's this creep of planned obsolescence.
I think without saying specifically, which I guess you can't do, saying specifically how to lobby, like, it was really shocking to me just now moving into a new place and like trying to change the light fixtures, and like I just hadn't done that in a while, and I was like, oh, it's like illegal. Like I had to do insane things. I had to order things from other countries, and like I was like, what is going? And then like in California, like I had to have stuff shipped to Wyoming and then like moved to California because it was like illegal. And I was like, what is going on? And you're right. Like I just didn't vote for any of that. That just like happened.
Yeah.
Like I don't have time every day to be like, no, don't do the light bulb stuff, right? And that was flabbergasting, because I do think, in fact, that like if people on the center left, like people who we just sort of trusted some of these people to be like, I'm from Ohio. I don't know. I'm like, Sherrod Brown's pretty cool. Like I trust Sherrod to have my interest at heart, and probably he does. But I'm not like making calls to his office being like, wait, my agency was just taken away. And then it's happening at the level of the NTSB, all this stuff. I think you're right that there is actually, sometimes people look for a policy lever. And in fact, what you need is just say like, look, my worldview is a really normal worldview, and there's a constituency for it.
Yeah. And it's exactly the people who have the least time to call their representative, who are the most impacted by this creep of like, the sucking sound of their agency being removed. And I think that's inherently part of the problem. And that's part of the problem too of the way that like DC is built, is that most of the people here are not driving beaters. They're not like trying to fix their stuff there at home, and so there's just been this narrowing of experience and worldview, and a kind of abdication. And I wonder how much Chevron will play into this, like the ability to like reform the legislative process to say like it needs to be more informed, and sort of like recircling those people who are impacted, who are implementing, who are seeing it, and not this sort of elitism of like, well, that's your like, implementation is not my problem. Like, yes, it is your problem. It is your problem. Right. If the people at daycare can't peel a banana, that is your problem.
Right. Okay, just a very quick point, because this started to drive me crazy as a young man. Like I started to realize that there was something going very wrong with how we managed our society, because you would hear from people in the sort of management levels of Western societies, from France to New York to whatever, that they would say like people chose to leave the farms. Americans chose to leave. Americans don't want to farm. And you're like, pull me on that. Give me you just weren't there when the Wisconsin dairy industry was collapsing. Those people didn't want to leave. What are you talking about? The suicide rate was like 20%. Like, but they just don't talk to enough people, And I'm wondering, maybe to close up, because I know I've already taken 10 minutes more of your time. Maybe to close up, like, I sense this, and I'd like to know if maybe I'm crazy, but I have a positive sense that actually we are living through a moment of revolt where those Wisconsin dairy farmer type people who were told by their overlords that actually they wanted to leave the farm, they didn't want to leave, have actually just sort of like had enough. And that actually this constituency we're talking about, whether it's left or right or whatever, actually is forming into something that is going to get us closer towards a positive politics of this kind of agency. I'm wondering if you think that's true, or if that's too sanguine, or like we're all going to, Elon Musk is going to kill everything, or, I'm wondering how you see that.
I think people there's a growing sense that like we got scammed and that like we need to fight now to maintain agency, and kind of call the question of like, well, why do I need a college degree to do any of this? Like why has that been presented as a failure to be good in shop class? And like all of this sort of the like weird techno optimism that we're gonna have like robots do all the work, and then like but now it turns out that the robots are gonna like now they're making art and writing, and like we're the ones doing the like boring shit, or whatever, and taking joy and pride in being good at making things and building things. Yeah, I think I have more confidence in the kind of agency and like I guess independence of Americans than a lot of folks, because they get inside like a certain activist class, and I'm like, well, but there's this whole other world that you're not seeing, and they're not watching cable news,
Right.
But like they have a very real political worldview. Is it? It's not partisan, but it is like the building of like what is worth having these discussions on, like what do we want and like how do we get there. But I see a lot of those discussions and a lot of the best stuff like outside of like the kind of DC framework.
Yeah.
So
I think
I
that's
should
a good
jet.
place to end. No, of
Yeah.
course, I've kept you,
No.
but this has been absolutely wonderful. It's just a delight, like the two times I've spoken to you, just to like have someone in Congress actually like capable of having these conversations. I think it's a really positive sign. And I think everybody on the various wings of this little movement like is wishing you the best and excited about you. So I think it's really cool. We really appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much. This is really fun. And I guess we'll see you around.
All right.
Bye.
If you could just hang out for 1 second while I hit stop.